Incredibly, 47 years after he first went to Washington as a senator, and even after 2 terms as vice president, Joe Biden gave his most important political speech today. He gave it from his home state of Delaware, plugged into the virtual convention hosted from Milwaukee. He's been derided for his basement strategy, making very few public appearances, muffing his lines when he has done, in online forums mainly, and steering clear of any interviews or questioning. But today, the Democratic nominee had to deliver the lines, try to overcome the doubters, and hit back at Donald Trump's dismissal of him as Sleepy Joe. And he decided the best form of defence was attack.
He's failed to protect America. And my fellow Americans, that is unforgivable. As president, I'll make you a promise. I'll protect America. I will defend us from every attack, seen and unseen, always, without exception, every time.
Now, apart from the Trump attacks, the other key theme was, sadly and predictably, identity politics. Just listen to how he pitches for his running mate, Kamala Harris.
She knows about all the obstacles thrown in the way of so many in our country. Women, Black Americans, South Asian Americans, immigrants, the left out and the left behind.
It's extraordinary to hear the focus on race in the US. A dozen years after Barack Obama was elected, the focus on racial tensions and divisions is more intense than it's been probably since the 1960s. Still, with the pandemic still crippling the US and the world, and the Black Lives Matter protests and violence still playing out around the US as well, there's no disguising the challenges of the moment. And Biden, despite being part of Congress and governments for many decades and part of the executive for 2 terms, he offers himself now as the president to turn it all around.
You know, American history tells us that it's been in our darkest moments that we've made our greatest progress, that we found the light. In this dark moment, I believe we're poised to make great progress again.
The Democrats are caught in a real paradox here. According to them, America is both ruined and racist, but it's also full of opportunity and unity. They're fueling divisions, but they're promising unity. Now, this speech was scripted, stilted and strangely subdued given the virtual audience, but that's been the case for all the major addresses at this convention. The online arrangements have dramatically changed the tempo, eradicating all the excitement and the hoopla. While Biden didn't really set out much of a plan, his team will be relieved, I reckon. He got through the speech, didn't make any major mistakes, seemed reasonably sure of what he was saying, and even managed to don a mask and walk outside for some theatrics afterwards with Kamala Harris. The election is just 74 days away, and this 77-year-old will be looking to minimise his mistakes, and to do that, he'll do as few appearances as possible. The Democrats know they need the focus to be on Donald Trump. The president will be campaigning largely against himself, with Biden winning if Trump can't win over more people than he turns off. He tweeted today that Biden's had 47 years in Washington to do the things he now promises to deliver. So the big question is whether Biden gets to extend that record of public service beyond 50 years. Let's bring in Nicholas Rees and Catherine McGregor, as we do every Friday. Good to talk to you. Let's start with you, Nicholas. Your first hit at Joe Biden. Did you find this man's speech inspiring?
Look, I watched the speech, Chris, and I thought it was very, very impressive. There was no Sleepy Joe there today, no Chauncey Gardner, as you like to call him.
I reckon there was a lot of Chauncey Gardner there. I'd like to give him an exam, test him on what he said half an hour later.
I think you're being uncharitable there. Look, it was a well-written speech, but it was also a very well-delivered speech. You know, he positioned himself as more presidential than partisan. I think that's what America's looking for. It played to his strengths as a sort of unifying optimist rather than a mean-spirited divider like Trump. There was a little bit of policy there on, tax breaks for the rich, how to tackle COVID-19, and a bit on climate change as well. But as is sometimes the case with presidential elections, it's more about spirit and optimism happening at a higher level, and he had plenty of that. I can tell you that Democrats weren't just relieved, Chris, as you said, they were delighted with how this speech went, and they've been very, very pleased with the conference as well. And we know that the Republicans are worried because, of course, Donald Trump, the president, has not complied with the usual convention around these things by not campaigning while his opponent's political party are having their convention. He's been out there doing political events over the last couple of days. And, of course, that's only just served to highlight the sort of chaos and division that comes with the Trump presidency. Peaking, of course, today with his former Svengali and campaign director being arrested for fraud. Like, you can't make this stuff up, can you?
I think
Steve Bannon arrested for fraud.
He was indeed a former Trump advisor. The key point here, Catherine, is twofold. This idea that Trump's out there campaigning, well, that's a direct contrast. Trump is out mixing with real people, travelling around the country campaigning while they sort of wheeled Biden out from a basement to read an auto cue. But to take up on the positives, to try and find some sort of bipartisanship here with Nicholas, Joe Biden is kind of the candidate from central casting. He is that safe, sure image, safe pair of hands. The trouble is he was that sort of 20 or 30 years ago. Does he have the dynamism to actually look like he can do the job?
Well, that's the big question. And look, to be generous and fair, he delivered a pretty decent speech. The question's going to be, how does he function away from the teleprompter when he's not scripted? I think that is the big question, because Nicholas and I have sparred over this right through the primary season. I think there is a genuine question about his cognitive ability. However, he delivered, and this is the problem for the Republicans, I fear, is that they set the bar pretty low, because by campaigning on his cognitive ability and calling him Sleepy Joe, the fact that he got through the thing was almost regarded as a triumph. And tone was pretty right. I thought the cadencing and writing of the speech was quite exceptional, frankly. So he came through that test unscathed. But every American presidential race tightens after Labor Day. Labor Day in early September, that's when if the gap's going to narrow, look for it to narrow after 1 September, and that's when the race is on. And I guess that's the huge question. Is Biden capable of withstanding scrutiny and engaging in one-on-one debates and doing genuine campaigning? That's the big question.
Well, this is what's going to be fascinating to watch, Nicholas. Now, we know in American campaigning there's much less of the cut and thrust. You don't actually do doorstops and stuff like we do here. It's a lot of set pieces, a lot of waving from a stage and reading from a teleprompter. But you're going to have to do at least some debates. And do you think, Nicholas, that Joe Biden will actually front up and do some one-on-one interviews with people like Chris Wallace, who have been after him week after week after week?
Look, he is definitely going to have to engage in the contest with Trump. So I think we will see some debates. And yes, I think he'll do a broader range of interviews. I agree with your analysis earlier about the Democrats' strategy. With them in front in the polls, they want to do everything they can to minimise the risks for Biden as their candidate. So that does mean rationing, if you like, his appearances and trying to limit the opportunities for mistakes to be made. And as you accurately said, they want to turn this race into a referendum on Trump, not a choice about two futures, Trump's or Biden's. But I think you've got to be careful, both of you, not to underestimate Biden. Like, don't forget the adversity he's got through in the course of his life. Obviously, losing his wife, his first wife and daughter in tragic circumstances, and then more recently his son, Beau. So he has come back, even in the primary race. Think back to that Iowa caucus right back at the start of the primaries where he came fourth, then he came fifth in New Hampshire. He was in a whole lot of trouble. But off the back of black voter support and sort of middle class and working class Democrats getting behind him, he's come back. He's now the candidate, and he's delivered a cracking good speech today. He's got
a terrific story. There's no doubt about it, as we mentioned last night. But Catherine,
thanks for your history lesson, Nicholas. But in 1988, he was driven out of the primaries for plagiarising Neil Kinnock's speech. So if you want to go into history about character, that's the reason he pulled out in '88.
But Catherine, the thing with Biden too is that while his 5 decades of Washington experience will reassure some voters, it also opens up the attack from Trump. I mean, he's the classic Washington establishment figure. He is part of the swamp. And it's another reason for Trump to attack him and say that you got to continue the job. You've got to give him 4 more years to try and drain the swamp.
Yeah, it just depends how much energy is left in this outsider narrative, frankly. You know, people are, I think, acutely aware that a lot is broken in the system of government, and the outsider narrative played very well against Hillary Clinton after uninterrupted wars in the Middle East, which is one of the things he has delivered on, is a steady disengagement of US forces in the Middle East. And I give him credit for that because it was draining American power. But the fact is, you've got what appears to be a chaotic failure of the public health system and a lot of people jobless. Now, those are the kind of numbers and factors that really play heavily against an incumbent, no matter how well they're regarded. So I'm just not sure there's a lot of resonance left in that narrative, Chris. Seriously, with the crises going now, they're more likely to go to a safe set of hands than respond to an outsider narrative when the arithmetic is so damning.
Yeah, I think it'll be replaced a lot by the law and order debate, but we will see that the economic...
And that's possible.
Yeah. Now, let's bring it back to domestic politics, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on this border shambles. Now, let's forget whether or not you agree with specific border regimes in Queensland, South Australia or elsewhere. Can we have a situation where the states just have carte blanche over this, Nicholas, or should there be, in a federation, some sort of national control over it?
Well, under our constitution, they shouldn't have carte blanche control over these things. In fact, one of the reasons why we became a federation with the constitution we've got was to actually get around these sort of things.
My point exactly.
But pandemics do strange things to convention, don't they? I mean, look, I support strong borders. You'll be very pleased to hear, Chris, when it comes to at least pandemics. And I think borders do have a serious role to play in managing a pandemic. Having said that, I do think that some of the restrictions in place do need to be subject to review. And I guess I'm supportive of where the Commonwealth Government is trying to push things in that regard. Like, you look at what's happening to our aviation sector, you look at what's happening to our tourism sector, and then you look at the data and level of risk, particularly in states like Western Australia, Northern Territory, Queensland, and you say, come on, guys, like we need to get movement going again. And then, of course, finally, you look at what's happening with some of those border communities with, farmers with properties on both sides of the border who can't run their farms, people who work in hospitals or school students who can't get to work or go to school. I mean, there needs to be a new arrangement put in place to get past that silliness.
It's driving us nuts, Catherine. There's a lot of premiers, 4 premiers in particular, who like playing the strong man or strong woman.
Yeah, well, again, Nicholas is right. There's a specific provision, and it's not a convention. It's the most explicit guarantee, one of the few explicit guarantees that overrides all of the Commonwealth's plenary powers, and that's Section 92, that states' trade, commerce and intercourse among the states shall be absolutely free.
But Scott Morrison has backed away from that legal test.
Yep, and to his great shame, in my view. And likewise, Alan Joyce was happy to throw in, $2 million odd into the plebiscite for same-sex marriage. He would have standing before the High Court if he wants to pony up and hire a team of silks. So I know there are a number of very senior constitutional lawyers absolutely chomping at the bit to get in front of the High Court with this case, because they think it's a slam dunk certainty, frankly, that the High Court would come down in favour of the traditional interpretation in Section 92.
As Nicholas said, and as I said at the top of the program, it's why we ended up with federation. It's one of the driving reasons to actually federate. So I'd love to see it tested in the High Court or confirmed in the High Court. Thanks so much for joining us, Nicholas and Catherine. Enjoy your weekend.
You too.
You too.
Nicholas Rees there and Catherine McGregor. I'll tell you what, Section 92 is pretty clear cut, but someone will test it in court. Clive Palmer, by the looks of things.